So I'm going to go ahead and get started because I think we're somewhat on time. But so, as I mentioned, they mentioned earlier, I'm Brandon Sanders. I'm one of the board folks. And so I'm going to kind of piggyback off of what Ryan was, and he kind of tried to take my title because mine. I'm supposed to be the king of alliteration tonight, so I'm really supposed to be the Baptist tonight. And so, but I don't have any cool like illustrations like he did. But so this second part, and part of the reason he and I were talking tonight too, and the reason this is really the reason all the dads are invited tonight is really talking about how we work this together as a family and like what's the real core of why we're doing this, right? And so mine is kind of the second part of that is, okay, we've talked about why we're homeschooling in general, but why here? Why Gathering Oaks? What are we doing? What are the core principles that we try to do and how we do it that we think is a good model? Not that it's the only one, but it's a good model to be Christ-centered and all. So again, to go with he even picked C's tonight too. So anyway, and my notes are, if you were here last year, there's a lot of carryover. I was trying to rewrite it all, and I was like, I don't think I can do this much different than this. And so it's going to piggyback a lot if you're here last year. But it's this cooperative is, considerate, cooperative, Christian, and community. And so those are the 4 C's I'm going to kind of talk about tonight. So the consideration starts even, a month, 2 months ago when we did registration. And you may not think about it like that, but so the consideration of being the investment as far as when we think about different elements of how we're investing in this community is financially, we came together was it really 3 years ago?
I cannot believe it. I know.
Sorry.
I'm having a hard time with it.
So when we came together 3 summers ago, this is technically the 3rd summer, but 2 years ago when we did this, we started talking about how to create this community where it doesn't have to be financially backbreaking, right? That we try to set a budget that we thought would be allowing us to honor God in our teaching and honoring God in what we're doing as a community, but not limit people to being able to be a part of it, and not strapping them at home so much that they couldn't be a part of it. And so trying to be mindful, just like we should be at home, being good stewards of what we're given. And so the tuition we try to keep as low as we could because that's part of why we don't pay teachers. But it's also part of why, getting into the other C here in a second, being cooperative is lace them up. Because if you've not been a part of the group before, we all have responsibilities, and it's so we can keep the cost down. And so, but the investments, the 3 things we talk about is finance, time, and to one another. Because it can't be a community of one. There is no community of one. And so we were talking in our small group time just a second ago that when we started homeschooling 10 years ago, whenever it was, we wouldn't be homeschooling if there was no community. 0 chance. It's by God's grace only that we're homeschooled to begin with, because when we were younger, I was really cracking up with Ryan's thing about saying, hey, you're kind of cute, maybe we'll have kids and homeschool together. And I was like, so before we had kids, our exposure to homeschooling before we got into this was me never having even known it was possible growing up. I grew up in a rural area of Kentucky where you didn't choose where you went to school. You just, whatever county you were from is, growing up in Kentucky, you didn't ask people what town they're from, unless you're from like a big city like Louisville. It was like, what county are you from? Well, because that's what all the high schools were. You went to the local high school of where you were from, and so that was it. There was no private school, there was no homeschool, there was nothing. And so the idea of homeschooling, my wife's only exposure was a couple of kids that came to her private school that she went to in Mississippi that were all socially weirdos, and she was like, we ain't doing that. And so our idea of homeschooling, being isolated, just wasn't an option. So being part of a community is a big deal. And we think about time. It's no secret that it's a major investment. We all know that. But it also has to be balanced, because if we're really trying to be going back to this cornerstone, the light that the illustration Ryan was using, if we're trying to mimic the first light, then we have to understand that our first ministry is at home. It ain't this community. This is sprouting off of that. It's one of those other lights that starts coming about. But as we all look at the person sitting next to us, that's the first ministry. So the time that even though I was kind of laughing when we said lace them up when you get here on Monday, but the rest of the week is to each other in your home and to your kids is the first ministry. And that even impacted, we were doing this a couple years ago too, of how to set it all up as we were trying to find curriculums. And Jenny's not in here, so I can make fun of her. So she was, she's the crazy one that would like rewrite a whole curriculum and build multiple campuses and all kinds of crazy stuff, right? But when we were picking a curriculum, we chose this thing with Claritas that was longer than we felt like it should be for the calendar year. So we even scaled that back because we were like, it doesn't fit who we are as a community. It doesn't fit how we feel like the ministry is to our families and the people who are already here, right? And so keeping that workload to the level it should be, because life doesn't revolve around school. And that's totally a foreign idea for me growing up, because in my house, it was not even a question of whether I was going to college. It was that you're going to college. And so so that kind of performance thing was a background of mine too. So but the last thing is to one another. And again, I've mentioned this already, but for those of you who are either new to homeschooling or new to Gathering Oaks, one thing that got us into homeschooling was, again, Jenny and Ryan, I would go to church with them, and so our son and one of their sons the same age. And so as we're going into the first year, before he even had to go to school, when he was 4, she was like, why don't you come try the homeschooling community we're part of, because you won't lose anything. He can't go to public school yet anyway. And so we didn't know what black hole she was drawing us into, and 10 years later we are, but it was that idea that you don't have to be the expert of homeschooling your first year in. And even 10 years in, nobody's an expert. We're all learning along the way. And that's really kind of the cool thing about the community, is the idea that, when you're coming in, there are quote unquote veteran families. There are some people, that are going to be homeschooling for 3 decades.
I'm sorry. That's me.
that have kids all over the place, right? And so that are homeschooling forever, that we can lean into. And I still remember, a few years ago when Kim and I were, we had 2 foster children at home, and we were in this comparison thing that Ryan was just talking about. And there's some friends of ours named Josh and Kendra Hall that are, you may or may not know them, but my wife was looking at Kendra. They have 6 kids, and here we were with 2, and then we just added 2 more, and it was like our world was like in total chaos, and just trying to keep our head above water. And my wife was saying, gosh, Kendra, you have this so much together, and just in awe of her at the moment. And Kendra goes, you've got to give yourself some grace. We stepped into this over years, and God prepared us from the time they were born. You got thrown into this. But it was that same idea that we could lean into somebody who'd been there with more kids and had juggled different bedtimes for all these different personalities that we didn't have to do before. That same element that goes here. That an example of that would be when you guys are registering, you had a point of contact, hopefully. And if not, then we failed as a board. Because the idea is everybody in this community was assigned to a board member. Because we're a community. Nobody's supposed to be left on an island. That's just one of the ways we support one another. Throughout the week, sure, we meet on Mondays, but how many of you guys that are here in the last year or 2 have occasionally seen another homeschooling family out of this co-op some other day during the week? I feel like every week there's something going on. I'm like, I thought we were supposed to homeschool at some point. Right? So there's always stuff going on like that, but that's leaning into each other to build a community, because again, the academics are a piece of it, right? And I went to college for a long time, but I've also learned, even thinking, to be able to say, I'm not concerned if my kids necessarily go to college if they're following what the Lord wants them to do. And I never thought I would say that when I was younger. But leaning into one another as part of the community, learning and understanding how to work within the body of Christ is as important, if actually more important, than the academic side. It's no comparison. And so this is just another facet of that, right? So going to cooperatives. So raise your hands if you've ever felt stress of any kind when it comes to educating your children. Or now even if that's not enough, or if you think about their future. Okay, good. So Galatians 6:2. Most of us are probably familiar with this passage when we think about bearing one of those burdens, right? As we go through this, if you think about even one child going from kindergarten through 12th grade, if you do it for the entirety of the spectrum, there are going to be life things that happen to to the people in this community, that we can bear the burdens, whether it be tragic losses in their families, just hurdles of how to get their kids in bed at night sometimes, and everything in between. But, we may not be under the same church name, but it's still, if we are coming together and we're proclaiming to the community of Tallahassee that we are a Christ-centered community, these things still hold true, that we should be bearing one of those burdens, because it's not about the building, right? And so if we're claiming those things, then we can bear one of those burdens. And I've seen that, like, when we see, well, I've already heard people asking, what are we supposed to bring for, or what do we do, where do we put what we're supposed to bring for Katie Gentry? For those of you who don't know her, she just lost her mom this week, and there's people already coming together trying to do the compassionate thing, right? And so bearing one of burdens that way. And then I mentioned before, reducing costs by all hands on deck. I think another thing that's neat about that is, sure, it reduces cost, and we don't have like the model of having a master teacher, we're a public school, private school, even some co-ops that have somebody who's a quote-unquote expert, and I say it that way flippantly because the longer I've been educating, the longer I've been even teaching. I teach training doctors that the more I understand, none of us are really experts at much of anything. And so I say that jokingly, but there's an element that then we also get to go back to this first piece about family being the first ministry, is that being able to step into the role of teacher, for those of you who are here on Mondays, I will do that, and what that says to the kids about being a learner, that they don't have to have a degree behind their name to learn something. They don't have to have a degree behind their name to challenge themselves and to learn it on their own. And so I think there's an element there that's actually better than having a quote-unquote expert that can look down their noses and be like, why didn't you know that? Well, I'm paying tuition for you to teach me that. Why should I know that already, or I wouldn't be here, for like people who are in college or whatever. And so that kind of persona from an instructor I've never clicked with at all. But we don't have to have that here, because as parents, we can step into a humble role and be servants to our kids, and we can teach them that serving is a big deal. And the idea of building community, I used this illustration last year, and I was going to go with something else, but I like this one better, so I'm going to stick with it. Has anybody in here ever been on a short-term mission trip with the church? So if you have, I want you to think through for just a second the kind of unity in that body that you have, right? Or, we're preparing a mission trip right now with the youth of our church, and we're going in a few weeks. The idea that you start getting together, that yes, you're part of a bigger body, you're part of something, other parts of your life, but when you get this team together that's going to serve a purpose, it helps you to maintain a single vision, a single focus, a single mission. And so when we come together here, it's kind of that way too, that you can come in on Monday and you're like, these are my people. Like, they're in the trenches with me, they're doing that. So that building the community there that way too. The third C in this is the idea of being Christian, right? And we say that, we proclaim it all over the place. It's on our codes of conduct, it's on our website, all that stuff, right? But Colossians 2, verse 6 7 says this, therefore, as you receive Christ Jesus Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him, and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. And so this idea, everything our logo, the name that we've kind of come up with, all this idea of being trees and being rooted in truth and all that was purposeful. And it's the idea really coming out of scriptures just like this, right? That we can come together from all different backgrounds, all different, stories, but our roots are the same. If we're rooted in truth of Christ, our root is the same. And so that we can then use that to build our kids up, to plant the seeds, and I'm really glad Ryan used that and all that cultivation stuff, because that we can be planting those seeds every Monday and every Wednesday and every field trip and every whatever, that when we come together, that's what it's about. So, last year, we back up 2 years ago, and we still do these yearly, this whole idea of like a Bible memory reward, right? But our group felt it was so important that this past year, we just added a whole curriculum for Bible. because it was like, this should be more than just an award at the end of the year, right? So now it's part of the curriculum. It's like, we want to be rooted in truth more than what we were the year before. So that's even another way we're constantly looking in the mirror, that we can be like, how can we be grounding our kids even more in the truth? And so, but even that, again, I keep going back to this idea of being first ministry, is we can take this and not just have it confined to a Bible class. And this is probably the biggest thing that I think we do here, or that we should be doing here, is we can weave that into every subject matter we teach, whether it's science, and looking at the wonder of creation, and not ignoring that God's fingerprints are all in it, that we don't have to do that. So, for those who don't know me, I was a biology major, chemistry major in college, and for years I had to spend writing answers on tests that I didn't believe, because I knew that's what I had to write for the class, but knowing it's God's fingerprints and stuff. It's not chance, it's not all, but we can teach that here, and we can teach them both perspectives, right? That, yes, there is the idea of macroevolution and abiogenesis and all this stuff, and we can prepare them for that, because that's what the world is going to teach them. But we can also teach them to think through things critically. And so, I didn't have that as a C, but we're going to add one, that we can teach critical thinking, right? that we can do that. And so, this last couple years, my son just finished 8th grade, and in 7th and 8th grade, as the curriculum changes, one of the big pieces they do is logic, and talking about how to defend their arguments and how to properly build their arguments. But what that does is helps them to critically assess the world around them. Now, for a 13-year-old boy who is unfortunately very sarcastic like his father, may get him into trouble when he tries to correct the fallacies that his mother's trying to explain something that we've had to correct a couple times over the last couple of years. I was like, time and place, son, time and place. And so, but the idea, right, that we get to teach them to think logically, to think critically, because we worship a God of order who obviously created all this with very, very intricate detail, right? That we can teach them to analyze that, and they can stand in that truth, because once they get to college and they have to defend that, there are more holes in the other arguments than this one, right? And so this idea of being rooted in truth, that it's not just about a devotional they do for 5 minutes a day, or devotional they do, for an hour or whatever, but that we can weave this in everything, and we get to weave it together, right? That we get to weave that in there. So the last C I've kind of talked about all through this is just the idea of community, right? That for those of you that have been a part of the group, understand you were laughing because when I was saying outside of Mondays, we're a Monday co-op, and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, so like there's just stuff going on all the time, right? And so I would encourage you, as much as possible, don't limit yourself to being a Monday co-op, right? When there are opportunities that you can have this community and have it be a true community that will definitely have your back, that will definitely encourage you and challenge you and all that. So that's what I would say is, why Gathering Oaks specifically is because it ain't just a co-op, right? It's a little deeper than that. It's not about Mondays and coming up and showing up and checking a few boxes in a classroom, right? It's about people around you being really the body of Christ, and us trying to function dysfunctionally that way as much as we can. So that being said, so we can, I think, break out
You're
in
awesome. You're right on
searching.
time. Yeah, so we're going to break back